From Illinois, Mr. Roskam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Starr and Mr. Lennick, thanks for your time. Secretary, I find your argument inconsistent in this sense, and I just want to bring to your attention a couple of the statements that you've made to my colleagues, some of the realities that I perceive, and walk you through my thinking. A couple of minutes ago, you told Ranking Member Cummings that there has been a culture change in the department. And if there has been a culture change in the department, that presupposes that you basically offer everything up that's an obstacle, and to recognize and to reflect, look, this is a problem, and we're going to rid ourselves of every single problem that was an obstacle to a remedy. A couple of minutes ago, you made the argument to Mr. Schiff, or not an argument, but you made the point, increasingly dangerous world. Nobody here disagrees with that. It was compelling. You use words like extremism, disaffected youth, and these posts that are unaccompanied because they're miserable places to go, presumably. And yet one of the things that is the remedy to that is the waiver authority and recommendation number 13 that the department continues to cling to. So the recommendation of the best practices panel in number 3, it says this. It says waivers to establish security standards should only be pursued subsequent to the implementation of mitigating measures as agreed by regional bureau or other program managers, advised by DS, and is informed by the department risk management model. That is a great idea. Now, here's the problem. The department, and I don't know where you were in the discussion, but the department has said, we don't think that's a great idea. In fact, we think this. In certain cases involving national security, I'm going to come back to that because that's such an ambiguous term, an exception can be approved based on the mitigating measures in place, presuming that there are mitigating measures, I might add, even though future mitigating measures may be planned to bring the facility even closer to or in conformance with the OSPB physical security standards. In such cases, when time is of the essence to further U.S. national security interests, the department requires flexibility to grant an exception prior to the implementation of planned mitigating measures. So here's my point. That is a gaping exception. And that is an exception, Mr. Secretary, that anything can get through. And I mean anything. So if it is simply, look, this is national security, all of a sudden that becomes a laminated hall pass for somebody at the Department of State to say, we're declaring this a national security emergency. Yeah, we've gone through the whole process, the process that you described, that is identifying the high-risk, high-threat, high-risk post, going through VP2. So far, there's no restraining influence. Then there's two choices, either recharacterize something as a special mission compound or something else, or go through another process. And even within the other formalized process, there's still this waiver authority, and people around you, Mr. Secretary, are saying, give it up. And by your own argument, I might add, you're making the argument that you should give it up, that there's a culture change that's so big that you're describing it to Ranking Member Cummings, and a world that is so dangerous that you're using all kinds of words that we all agree with. So why in the world hang on to this thing?
For a very specific technical reason, sir. We pick a place. Sometimes the best that we can get in a short duration if we're going to go back in. We have to make decisions on what needs to be done and what level of things we can't possibly do. I can't create 100 feet of setback when there isn't 100 feet of setback. And we may have to accept that. And at a certain point, we have to make decisions. Are we going to accept that, do the rest of the things that we need to do, or are we just going to say, no, we're not going to accept that, and then continue looking until we find a place? By the way, I've never found a place to lease in 30 years in the department that actually had 100 feet of setback that was available.
Secretary Starr, what is different than the reasoning that you just articulated to me just now,
right,
from the reasoning that put us in Benghazi and that allowed 4 people to be killed? What is different?
There is, I will admit, that there is some measure of risk in what I am saying. But
Huge risk, based on what you
No,
told
I don't.
Mr.
I don't
Schiff.
agree that it's huge risk. I think that
Well, you
we
just
have
told
to,
him it was a dangerous world filled with this extremists and disaffected youth. That was 5 minutes ago.
True. But I think that we have to be able to make decisions to progress. In some cases, if we're going to lease a new facility, we're going to have to admit that we're going to have to give waivers to certain things in order to fulfill that.
So what's different about what you just articulated?
The difference is that we have to do the waivers, that there has to be a decision process.
Yeah, but then why don't you agree to the mitigation? That was the key finding of the best practice.
Because in some places we can't get the mitigation.
And so if you
I cannot get a blast-proof building unless I build it.
Then why do we ask people to go to these places?
Because in some cases the foreign policy imperatives of why we need to be there mean that we're going to take reasonable levels of risk. Now, what we have to be careful is that we don't unreasonable levels of risk. There has to be an open and fulsome discussion about why we need to be there. What risks are we really running? Do you really understand the threats?
Best practice panel recommendation is trying to codify that risk discussion. And if you rewind the tape today and you listen to the answers that you gave, and I was carefully listening to this earlier in our last discussion time, the last hearing, Ms. Roby asked you a question, and you and I had an exchange about your answer, but just to refresh your memory, she asked, is it possible for the State Department to open a temporary residential facility? And you said, we don't have any at the moment. I can't imagine that we would or that I would approve it. You, singularly, Mr. Starr. Earlier today, in part of the exchange, you said, I'm committed to keeping our people as safe as possible. Now, I get it. That's opening statement language, and there's nothing wrong with that. You then told Ms. Sanchez, I turned that down. You then told Mr. Jordan, I have access. And your bristle was up a little bit because he was pushing you around, but you were saying, I have access to the Secretary of State. Now, here's the problem. When you're gone, that next person will be confronted with the same discussion that you admitted is basically that there's nothing really different about the thinking that went in on Benghazi, to your knowledge, because you told us you weren't there. I'm telling you that I think it is very similar, that line of thinking that says, yeah, it's dangerous, we got to get and we got to go, and yeah, there's no time, and we got to check these boxes, and yeah. And you've got this national security exception that the exception, like I've described, is this big, and we're right back into this situation. Notwithstanding the culture change that you've offered up, do you see which is why people around you are saying, give it up. Offer it up. You don't need it.
I think that relying on one recommendation.
This is not one recommendation.
No, that's one particular recommendation that we don't agree with. Because of a technical reason that we have to be able to say in advance and write the waivers and say we're going to accept waiving that security standard gives us the ability to do these things.
Look,
the larger issue though is things like VP2 and having processes in place. And I recognize that this one particular one is confusing in terms of it seems like we don't want to process.
Oh, it's not confusing to me.
It seems like we don't want to process there, but the fact is there is a process there.
Confusing about this. You're basically saying we're not going to mitigate. No, you're not basically saying. You're saying we're not going to mitigate. And these answers that the State Department has offered, it presupposes mitigation that's already in place, and it's relying on a speculation of possible mitigation. In fact, it says it may be planned. May be planned. That's speculation beyond speculation. This is speculation upon speculation. Do you see how it is that people are coming to the conclusion that in a post-Starr era, that like it or not is coming, in a post-Starr era, when special committees are not around, there's going to be every bit of possibility and pressure based on the national security exemption, which, as I've described it, is this big. All of a sudden, we're right back into this situation, and we're grieving the loss of life. I ask you to revisit this. I ask you to reconsider this. This is something that you're clinging to and that you ought not. I yield back.